She was a struggling waitress dreaming of art amidst greasy spoons. He, the fiancé, trapped in a gilded cage of duty and a missing heiress. When a case of mistaken identity swept her into his family's opulent mansion, living a life of luxury and falling for the man she should never have, her makeshift fairy tale was destined to collide with reality. The return of the true heiress was only the beginning of the story. Before we dive deeper into Ava's unexpected journey, make sure you're subscribed to the channel so you don't miss out on more incredible stories. And let us know in the comments where you're listening from. We love hearing from our amazing audience around the world. The rancid smell of frying oil clung to Ava Petrov's hair, an unwelcome perfume that even the cheapest soap couldn't entirely disguise. It was nearly 2 a.m, and Joe's Diner, a flickering neon bastion of lukewarm coffee on the city's forgotten outskirts, was finally beginning to empty. Her feet, crammed into worn-out black waitress shoes whose soles had seen better. Days and months and years pulsed with a familiar ache after a brutal 14-hour shift. Double duty to cover for a sick colleague. Double the tables, double the wrong orders, double the forced smiles for impatient customers. As she wiped down the sticky Formica countertop with a damp cloth, her eyes drifted to a quick sketch she'd made on the back of a discarded customer check. The tired but kind face of an old man who had eaten alone in the corner, reading a dog-eared paperback. It was an impulse she couldn't control, the need to capture fragments of the world around her with a pencil or pen. Her real dream, kept locked away in the depths of her exhausted mind, was a small studio flooded with natural light, the sharp scent of turpentine and oil paint replacing that of burnt bacon, the freedom to spend hours lost in colors and shapes on a canvas instead of balancing trays and reciting the daily specials. But studios, canvases and paints cost money, a resource as scarce as free time in her life. Her wages barely covered the rent on her tiny room in a run-down building and the basic bills. Art was a luxury from another universe. She said goodbye to Joe, the burly, taciturn owner who was counting coins at the cash register, and stepped out into the cold, damp night. The last bus to her neighborhood had departed long ago. She faced the long walk, nearly an hour, through poorly lit streets and silent industrial blocks. She huddled inside her thin coat, fatigue weighing down every muscle. She hadn't eaten anything substantial since lunch. A sandwich gulped down hastily between orders. She felt a slight dizziness, a floating sensation she attributed to extreme exhaustion and hunger. Hundreds of miles away, in a setting Ava could only imagine through the pages of old magazines, Julian Thorne III stood in a mahogany-paneled library, the silence broken only by the soft crackle of the fire in the marble hearth. The air smelled of old leather, polished wood, and the subtle aroma of single malt whiskey in his crystal tumbler. A glass he held, but had barely touched in the last 2 hours. Outside the tall arched window, the grounds of the Devereux estate stretched out like a dark, perfectly manicured carpet under the light of the crescent moon. Julian was the reluctant heir to the Thorne fortune, a dynasty built on shrewd investments and social connections cultivated over generations. And he was engaged to Anastasia Devereux, the sole granddaughter and heiress to the vast Devereux fortune, consolidated in land, mining, and who knew what else. A marriage that felt more like a corporate merger than a union of hearts, orchestrated with cold precision by Anastasia's grandmother, the formidable and controlling matriarch, Matilda Devereux, and Julian's own father. It was a duty, an expectation, the next logical move on the grand chessboard of elite families. But Anastasia, his classically beautiful and notoriously volatile fiancée, had been missing for 6 long months. She had simply vanished after another explosive argument with her grandmother about the wedding plans, leaving behind a vague note and a trail of unanswered questions. The police had investigated discreetly. Private detectives were hired and dismissed, but there were no leads. The official story for the public and the press was that Anastasia was traveling indefinitely in Europe, seeking inspiration. A transparent, "Life you swallowed." Julian felt the crushing pressure of maintaining appearances, of reassuring business partners worried about the instability of the Devereux-Thorne alliance, of dealing with Matilda's cold anxiety and his father's veiled impatience. But beneath the calm, controlled facade, he felt a profound emptiness, a growing sense of being adrift in a luxurious but purposeless life. He admired Anastasia's intelligence, her stunning beauty, but he had never felt for her the overwhelming passion, the intimate connection he secretly longed for. His own forgotten dream, designing innovative, sustainable buildings, working with his hands and mind to create something tangible, seemed like a childish fantasy against the realities of managing a financial empire and fulfilling his dynastic role. And now he was engaged to a ghost. Ava turned a particularly dark corner, her head bowed against a gust of wind that carried the smell of imminent rain. The dizziness she'd felt earlier returned with a vengeance. The yellowish streetlights began to spin, merging into nauseating blurs. A low hum started in her ears. Need to sit down, she thought in panic, scanning for a step, a wall, anything. Just too tired. It was her last coherent thought before her legs buckled like a rag doll's. The concrete sidewalk rushed up to meet her, and darkness enveloped her, completely before she could even register the impact. She didn't know how long she lay there, unconscious on the cold, dirty pavement. It was the sharp sound of tires screeching to a halt, very close, that pulled her back from the abyss, not to full consciousness, but to a floating, disoriented state. She heard voices, muffled as if underwater, but laced with urgency and recognition. It's her, heavens, it's Miss Anastasia. Quickly, Thomas, help her, call Mrs. Devereux immediately. Firm but surprisingly gentle hands lifted her from the cold ground. She felt the soft wool of an expensive coat brush against her cheek. A subtle, expensive and unfamiliar floral scent mingled with the smell of rain on the pavement. She was carefully placed in the back seat of a car, the supple leather upholstery cradling her aching body. She tried to open her eyes, to protest, to say there was a mistake, but a heavy veil of exhaustion and confusion pulled her back into unconsciousness. Her last sensation was of the car gliding smoothly down the street. When Ava woke for the second time, it was to an almost absolute silence, broken only by the soft ticking of a distant clock. The light entering the room was filtered through heavy brocade curtains, casting a golden glow over everything. She was lying in the most comfortable bed she had ever felt in her entire life, under a down duvet that felt like a cloud. The room was vast, decorated with understated but undeniable luxury. Antique dark wood furniture, silk-lined walls in shades of cream, a plush Persian rug beneath her bare feet when she cautiously swung them out of bed. Draped over a Louis XV armchair was an ivory silk dressing gown. She herself was wearing a fine silk nightgown, certainly not the old mended t-shirt she usually slept in. Panic began to bubble in her chest like boiling water. Where was she? What was this place? She looked out the tall window and saw a vast, green lawn stretching towards a distant wood. No busy streets, no neighboring buildings. She was far from her neighborhood, far from her life. She remembered the voices, the confusion. Anastasia. Miss Anastasia. The double doors to the room opened silently, and an elderly woman entered. She was tall and thin, with an impeccable posture that even advanced age couldn't diminish. Her silver hair was swept into a perfect chignon, and her pale blue piercing eyes fixed on Ava with an intensity that made her instinctively shrink back. She wore a pale grey wool dress that exuded quiet, expensive elegance. Close behind her came the younger man Ava had briefly seen the night before. Tall in a well-cut dark suit, his concerned blue eyes now assessing her with a mixture of relief and profound confusion. "Anastasia, my dear, you're finally awake," the older woman exclaimed, her voice surprisingly strong, approaching the bed with quick but controlled steps. Her thin hands, adorned with discreet but certainly valuable rings, grasped Ava's. They were cold. "Oh, my child, you can't imagine the torment we've been through. 6 months. Where have you been? What happened to you?" Ava blinked, her mind reeling. Anastasia. They really thought she was this Anastasia. She looked at the younger man, who now stood beside the older woman. He watched her with an intensity that made her want to disappear. "Anastasia, it's me, Julian," he said, his voice soft but laced with contained emotion. "Your fiancé. Do you remember me? Do you remember anything?" Julian Thorne. The fiancé. That name. The pieces began to fall into terrifying place. They had mistaken her for his missing fiancé. The resemblance must be astounding. Panic threatened to suffocate her. She wanted to scream, "I'm not her, my name is Ava Petrov, I'm a waitress." But the words died in her dry throat. Fear paralyzed her. She looked at their faces, the imperious grandmother, the wealthy, confused fiancé. These were people of immense power and wealth. What would they do to her if they discovered the truth? Would they believe her implausible story of a fainting waitress found by chance? Or would they accuse her of being a grifter, an imposter trying to take advantage of the situation? Would the police be called? Would she be arrested? The fear of losing the little freedom and the miserable life she had was stronger than the urge to tell the truth in that moment. I don't know," she managed to whisper, her voice hoarse and weak. She clutched her head with her hands, an instinctive tactic to buy time to appear confused. "My head hurts and everything is blurry." The older woman, Matilda Devereux, the matriarch, as Ava would soon confirm, seemed to accept the explanation, perhaps because she wanted to accept it. "Of course, dear, don't strain yourself. You've suffered a terrible shock. You must have hit your head when whatever happened, happened. The important thing is that you're back. You're safe now. We'll take care of you." There was a possessive note in her voice, a cold determination beneath the superficial concern. Julian continued to watch her, his blue eyes narrowed, a furrow of doubt between his brows. He seemed less convinced, or perhaps just more shaken by the situation. In the days that followed, Ava was immersed in a world that was simultaneously a dream and a nightmare. Their private physician, Dr. Albright, a grey-haired man with discreet manners, examined her at length. He asked questions about her memory, her past, to which Ava responded with evasions, shrugs, and mumbles about flashes and fog. Dr. Albright solemnly diagnosed post-traumatic dissociative amnesia, likely triggered by the stress of her disappearance and return. He recommended rest, a quiet, familiar environment, and no pressure to remember. It was the perfect excuse Ava needed, delivered on a medical silver platter. She was surrounded by an army of silent, efficient staff, maids who tidied her room, now her room, cooks who prepared exquisite meals she ate in a formal dining. Room under Matilda's watchful eye, gardeners who tended the vast grounds she saw from her window. She was given a new wardrobe filled with designer clothes that felt like costumes on her body. She quickly learned to move silently through the carpeted corridors of the mansion to observe the rituals of this wealthy family, the formal afternoon teas, the quiet dinners, the veiled conversations about business and society. She discovered more about Anastasia through Matilda's comments, Julian's hesitant questions, and photo albums she found in the library. The real heiress seemed to be everything Ava was not: outgoing, impetuous, somewhat spoiled, obsessed with fashion, parties, and expensive travel. The photos showed her at glittering social events, on luxurious yachts, at exclusive resorts, always with a slightly bored or defiant smile. The physical resemblance was indeed striking: the same height, the same delicate bone structure, the same dark hair and light eyes. But there was a hardness in Anastasia's gaze in the photos that Ava hoped she didn't possess. Julian was a constant but initially distant presence. He played his role as the concerned fiancé, asking about her well-being, bringing her books, after she mentioned liking to read, one of the few truths she let slip. But there was an invisible barrier between them. He watched her intensely, as if searching for the woman he knew, the fiancé who had disappeared. Ava felt his scrutiny and shrank inwardly, terrified he would see through the charade at any moment. Matilda, on the other hand, was a force to be reckoned with. She tried to jog Anastasia's memory with stories from the past, questions about friends and events, veiled tests about the granddaughter's likes and dislikes. "You always adored caviar, Anastasia. Don't tell me you've forgotten." "The taste?" she asked during one dinner, her eyes fixed on Ava as a servant offered the expensive delicacy. Ava, who had never tasted caviar in her life, managed to try a tiny amount and make a neutral comment about it being interesting, narrowly escaping. The grandmother was like a general commanding her territory, and Ava felt she was constantly walking through a minefield. But gradually something began to shift in the dynamic with Julian. Perhaps it was Ava's quietness, her less demanding behavior, her apparent lack of interest in the luxuries surrounding her. Though she was secretly awestruck, fear kept her subdued. He started to relax slightly in her presence, to share fragments of his own thoughts. "You know, Anastasia, you used to complain quite a bit about the countryside," he remarked one day, as they watched horses grazing in a distant paddock. "Said, it was boring, but now you seem almost peaceful here. Maybe I just need calm after everything," Ava replied, choosing her words carefully. He nodded thoughtfully. "Maybe. Or maybe you've changed." There was a note of hope in his voice that made Ava's guilty heart clench. They began to have longer conversations, often initiated by him. They discovered a shared taste for classic novels in the mansion's vast library. He spoke about his frustrated passion for architecture, showing her some of his old sketches he kept hidden away. Ava, in turn, risked talking vaguely about the beauty of nature, about finding meaning in small things. Genuine feelings of hers, but which she attributed to her new post-trauma perspective. With each passing day, the attraction between them grew, subtle but undeniable. An accidental brush of hands reaching for the same book, a lingering gaze across the dinner table, a shared silence in the garden that felt more intimate than any words. Ava found herself increasingly drawn to Julian, not the thorn heir but the sensitive, intelligent man she glimpsed beneath the polished surface. And she saw in him a reflection of her own sense of displacement, of being trapped in a life that didn't fully belong to her. But fear was her constant companion. The fear of a slip-up, a wrong word, of encountering someone from Anastasia's past who asked too specific a question. The fear that at any moment, the door might open and the real heiress might walk in, shattering the fragile house of cards she had built. She lived on a knife's edge, suspended between an unexpected fairy tale and the imminent threat of discovery. And her growing feelings for Julian made everything infinitely more complicated and dangerous. The days at the Devereux mansion bled into weeks, and Ava felt herself becoming increasingly entangled in the life that wasn't hers. The line between performance and reality grew dangerously thin, especially in Julian's presence. His initial caution had almost completely dissolved, replaced by a fascination and affection that were as genuine as they were terrifying for Ava. He seemed to relish the company of this new Anastasia, the quiet woman who preferred the library to the boutique, who listened with genuine attention when he spoke of his frustrations with the Thorn Empire, and whose eyes, he'd once remarked, seemed to hold a depth he'd never noticed before. They spent more time together. Julian insisted on helping her retrieve her memory through activities that, conveniently, were things he himself enjoyed. Long walks through the estate's woods became a refuge. He, a reluctant encyclopedia of local flora and fauna, would point out centuries-old oaks and identify the calls of elusive birds. Favor, her artistic sensibility latent but sharp, absorbed the nuances of light filtering through the leaves, the rough texture of tree bark, the contrast between emerald moss and damp earth. "Look how the light hits that fern, Julian," she murmured. "Once it looks almost translucent, and the shadow it casts." He stopped, watching not the fern but her face, illuminated by a genuine, unartful enthusiasm. "You notice things most people overlook, Anastasia," he said, his voice low. Ava blushed, looking away, reminded that even her appreciation of beauty was in this context a lie. The riding lesson was another milestone. Matilda had insisted, reminding her granddaughter of her youthful love for Ebono, the family's spirited black stallion. The real Anastasia, Julian confided to Ava in a low voice, actually detested riding after a fall in her teens, but kept up the pretense for her grandmother. Ava, whose closest contact with horses had been watching them pull tourist carriages downtown, was petrified, but Julian, sensing her genuine fear, which he attributed to trauma, was the epitome of patience. He saddled a gentler horse himself, a chestnut mare named Melody, and guided her step by step, his firm hand over hers on the reins, explaining posture, rhythm, the silent communication between rider and animal. The warmth of his hand, the closeness, of his body as he adjusted her stirrup, sent waves of electric shock through Ava, a mixture of fear and an attraction that made her dizzy. By the end of the afternoon, she managed a tentative trot around the paddock, a small personal triumph that brought a smile to her face, a smile Julian returned with a warmth that felt more potent than the late afternoon sun. The library became their unofficial sanctuary. Away from Matilda's watchful eyes and the staff's silent efficiency, surrounded by the scent of old paper and leather, they talked late into the night. They discovered a shared love for Dickens and Austen, although Ava had read her worn-out copies from the public library, while Julian owned leather-bound first editions. He revealed more about his frustrated passion for architecture, unfolding old sketchbooks filled with designs for eco-friendly buildings and community spaces, drawings full of talent and idealism that he quickly put away again, as if they were forbidden secrets. "My father calls them artistic dalliance is incompatible with managing a global portfolio," he confessed with a sigh. Ava, feeling genuine empathy for that stifled dream, risked sharing a little more of her own veiled truth. She spoke of the importance of having a space to create, of how art could give voice to the forgotten, of the beauty she found in the resilience of the ordinary people she saw every day, all attributed to her newfound sensitivity post-trauma. Julian listened intently, asking questions that showed he wasn't just being polite but genuinely interested. "You have an artist's soul, Anastasia," he said thoughtfully one evening, catching her off guard. "I don't remember you speaking like this before." Ava looked away, her heart pounding. "Because I'm not who you think I am," a silent voice screamed inside her. The physical tension between them was a constant undercurrent, the brush of hands on the bookshelf, the proximity in the paddock. There were other moments. One evening, during a particularly long and tedious formal dinner with elderly neighbors from the estate, Ava felt Julian's foot brush against hers under the table. It was a subtle touch, almost imperceptible but deliberate. She looked up and met his gaze, a spark of complicity, and perhaps something deeper in his blue eyes. She felt her face flush and quickly turned her attention back to the conversation about pruning roses, but the subtle contact sent a tingle through her entire body. However, the shadow of discovery lengthened with each passing day. The tea with Penelope Ainsworth was the first major alarm bell. Penelope, with her sharp memory for gossip and details of their Swiss boarding school life, asked questions that left Ava stammering and resorting to the fog of amnesia with increasing frequency. "But Stasia, remember that time we put salt in Monsieur Dubois' sugar bowl? You laughed for a week," Penelope exclaimed. Ava could only manage a strained smile. "Vaguely. The details are difficult." The conversation was torture, and Penelope's piercing glance as she left the mansion left Ava certain that Anastasia's childhood friend was unconvinced. Matilda Devereux, with her razor-sharp intellect, certainly noticed too. Her questions became more pointed, more like interrogations disguised as casual conversation. During a visit to the stables, where Ava tried to look familiar but was clearly uncomfortable near the large animals, Matilda remarked, "Ibano seems to miss you, Anastasia. He was always your favorite. Strange how you won't even try to approach him now." On another occasion, she showed Ava a jewelry box. "Darling, help me find that pair of Baroque pearl earrings you wore to the debutante ball. I can't seem to place them." Ava stared at the sea of glittering jewels, feeling utterly lost. The grandmother started leaving magazine articles about miraculous amnesia treatments open on the living room coffee table. She mentioned with increasing frequency the need to stimulate recovery with visits from more old friends, trips to familiar places from Anastasia's past. Each suggestion was a fresh threat to Ava. The safe, albeit false world she inhabited seemed to be shrinking. The stress began to take a physical toll. Ava started suffering from tension headaches. Sleep was a rare luxury, interrupted by vivid nightmares where familiar faces from her old life, Joe from the diner, her impatient landlady, mingled with the faces of Matilda and Julian in scenes of judgment and humiliation. She saw herself running through endless corridors in the mansion, pursued by a shadowy figure that was both Anastasia and herself. She would wake up in a cold sweat, heart racing, the loneliness and fear crushing her in the soft, silent bed. The discovery of the abandoned art studio became her only, albeit imperfect, refuge. She returned there whenever she could, both fascinated and repelled by Anastasia's unfinished paintings. They were dark, chaotic, filled with a violent energy that contrasted with the polished photos of the heiress. There were sketches of contorted faces, stormy landscapes, and that disturbing self-portrait. Who was the woman behind those angry brushstrokes? Was she just a bored dilettante, or was there real pain there? Ava felt a strange, uncomfortable empathy for the woman whose identity she had stolen. She tried to paint herself, using some old, almost dry acrylics she found. She wanted to paint the sunlight in the gardens, the kindness in Julian's eyes, but all that came out in her hesitant strokes was confusion and fear. The blank canvas seemed to mock her own lack of authenticity. Julian, noticing her increasing pallor and anxiety, became even more protective. "You don't have to force yourself to remember everything at once, Anastasia," he said gently one evening. "Give it time and know that I'm here for you, for who you are now." He reached across the library table and took her hand. This time, there was no interruption. Ava looked down at his hand covering hers, then up at his sincere, concerned face. The temptation to confess, to end the lie right then and there, was almost unbearable, but the fear of the consequences, losing Julian, facing Matilda's wrath, the public humiliation, silenced her once more. She only squeezed his hand back, a gesture that felt like it sealed her betrayal even further. Matilda, however, was not content to wait. She had summoned Dr. Albright again, insisting on more aggressive therapies to retrieve her granddaughter's memory. She spoke openly about resuming the wedding plans as soon as Anastasia was stronger. The pressure on Ava mounted exponentially. She felt like an actress in a play that refused to end, with the scenery starting to crumble around her. To complicate matters further, Julian began subtly distancing himself from the Thorne family business, questioning decisions, postponing important meetings, spending more time at the Devereux estate with Ava. This did not go unnoticed by Julian's father, who paid an unexpected visit to the mansion. The conversation between father and son, overheard accidentally by Ava through a slightly ajar door, was tense. Mr. Thorne accused Julian of neglecting his duties, of being influenced by the new and strange Anastasia. Julian defended Ava, or the idea he had of her, speaking of finding a different perspective, of questioning the path always imposed on him. The argument ended without resolution, but made it clear to Ava that her presence there was causing rifts, not only in the Devereux family, but in the Thorne dynasty as well. The climax of Ava's internal turmoil arrived during the preparations for the Devereux family's annual autumn ball, an event Matilda was determined to hold to show the world Anastasia was back and well. Trying on haute couture gowns, discussing guest lists with names that meant nothing to her, practicing waltzes with Julian, whose touch now made her feel an agonizing mixture of pleasure and panic. It all felt surreal and unbearable. The night, before the ball, unable to sleep, Ava crept down to the dark library. She found Julian there, staring into the dying embers of the fireplace, his expression fraught. "Can't sleep either?" she asked softly. He turned, offering her a tired smile that didn't reach his eyes. "Thinking about everything." He walked towards her. Anastasia, I've been thinking a lot. About us. About what I said about starting over." He hesitated, searching for the words. "I can't go on with this. Not with the arranged wedding, not with the life they expect of me. I feel like I'm drowning." His blue eyes met hers, filled with a desperate intensity. "The time I've spent with you, even with all the confusion, it's the most real thing I've felt in years. You make me question everything." He stepped closer, the heat from his body enveloping her. "I know it's crazy. I know you're still recovering. But I have to ask. Is there a chance, Court, for us, a real chance?" Before Ava could articulate a response, before the knot in her throat could loosen, he pulled her to him. The kiss was different from the others. There was less tenderness and more urgency, a desperate passion that spoke of fear and desire and the need to escape. Ava found herself responding with the same intensity, logic, and guilt, momentarily swept away by the overwhelming force of her feelings for him. They clung to each other in the silent library, like two drowning people grasping for a lifeline. When they finally broke apart, breathless, he held her face between his hands. "Run away with me, Anastasia. After the ball tomorrow, we don't have to come back here. We can go anywhere. Take the money I have access to, disappear. Start fresh. Somewhere the names Thorne and Devereaux mean nothing. Where we can just be Julian and you." The proposal was dizzying. Run away. Leave everything behind. Start a new life with Julian. It was the answer to all her prayers and the embodiment of all her fears. Yes, it was what she wanted more than anything. But how? How could she build a life on the lie of her identity? He was asking the new Anastasia to run away with him, not Ava Petrov. The guilt crushed her. "Julian, I need to," she began, her voice trembling. The words were on the tip of her tongue. The confession. The truth. "I am not Anastasia," she had to say it. Had to risk losing everything for the slim possibility of gaining something genuine. But fate, or perhaps just the cruel timing of real life, intervened. The distinct sound of tires crunching on the gravel driveway cut through the tense silence of the night. Powerful headlights swept across the tall library windows, momentarily illuminating Ava and Julian's startled faces. They both turned towards the window, then back at each other, a cold foreboding settling between them. No one was expected. They heard the heavy front door of the mansion creak open. Voices echoed from the grand entrance hall, Matilda's voice, high-pitched with irritation and surprise. "But what is the meaning of this? At this hour?" And then another voice, a female voice, arrogant, cutting, laced with a mocking tone that sent shivers down Ava's spine. A voice she had only heard in her imagination, based on stories and paintings, but one she recognized instantly with dreadful certainty. With hearts hammering painfully against their ribs, Ava and Julian moved silently to the massive library door, pulling it open just a crack. The scene in the chandelier-lit entrance hall was like something ripped from Ava's most terrifying nightmares. There stood Matilda, rigid with shock and indignation, and facing her, shaking raindrops from an expensive black leather jacket onto the priceless Aubusson rug, stood a young woman. Dark hair tangled from the rain, ripped jeans, heavy boots, and a face that was an almost perfect mirror of Ava's. But where Ava's eyes held fear and uncertainty, this young woman's blazed with defiance, boredom, and a cold, hard malice. It was Anastasia Devereaux, the real heiress, and she was undeniably, dramatically back. Ava's makeshift fairy tale had just collided head-on with brutal reality. The very air in the library seemed to solidify, growing heavy and difficult to draw into Ava's lungs. She felt each drop of blood flee her face, leaving behind a clammy, icy pallor as a low hum resonated in her ears. Beside her, Julian stood utterly frozen, a statue carved from shock and disbelief, his eyes azuis before filled with a desperate, confused passion now wide, fixed on the figure who had emerged from the rainy night like a vengeful spectre. There stood Anastasia Devereaux, not the gentle, frightened version he had somehow come to love, but the original, in all her glory, desafiadora and caustica. The mirror was broken, and its fragments reflected a truth far harsher than any illusion. In the grand entrance hall, the atmosphere crackled with a tension thick enough to taste. Matilda Devereaux, after a flicker of shock that briefly humanized her features, rapidly reassembled her steely facade. "Anastasia!" Her voice cut through the tense silence, sharp and brittle as breaking glass. "Where, in God's green earth, have you been for 6 months? Have you lost your mind entirely, and what is the meaning of this entrance? Appearing in the dead of night dressed like some sort of street urchin?" Anastasia let out a short, brittle laugh, utterly devoid of humor, the sound echoing unpleasantly in the cavernous space. "Oh, Grandma, your warm welcome practically brings tears to my eyes." She ran a hand through her wet, dark hair, deliberately flicking droplets onto the impeccable Persian rug, a small, calculated act of rebellion. "Let's just say I took a much-needed, extended vacation from your suffocating supervision. Traveled, saw the real world, or at least the parts of it my trust fund could afford. Met fascinating people, the kind you'd find utterly deplorable. Ran out of cash for the 5-star suite in Bali, figured I'd pop back to the ancestral vault for a refill, and maybe stir things up a bit. Her gaze, sharp and assessing, swept the opulent hall, lingering on the portraits of stern-faced ancestors, and the heavy, expensive furniture, with an air that mingled bored familiarity with inherent ownership. I see nothing's changed. Same suffocating decor, same deadly formal atmosphere, except her eyes, so uncannily like Ava's yet worlds apart, in their cold assessing light, narrowed as they landed on the partially open library door. She sensed them, perhaps caught a flicker of movement, or maybe just possessed a predator's instinct for hidden prey. With a slow, deliberate stride that amplified the tension, she began walking towards the library, the mocking smirk on her red, lips widening. Julian, in a reflex almost unconscious, moved slightly, positioning himself so as to partially obstruct the view of Ava, a hesitant human shield. Anastasia paused at the threshold of the door, her head tilted, her icy gaze shifting from Julian with his stunned expression to Ava, cowering in the shadow behind him. Anastasia's scrutiny was slow, deliberate, insolent, traveling over Ava, from head to toe, noting the silk nightgown, her nightgown, and borrowed robe, the evident fear in the light eyes that were a disturbing reflection of her own. The malicious amusement in her eyes intensified. "Well, well, well," Anastasia purred, drawing out the words, savoring the moment of maximum discomfort. "But what a lovely scene. Julian, my darling, ever so faithful fiancé, aren't you going to introduce me to your late-night companion? Or perhaps I should call her my understudy." She took another step into the library, forcing Julian to retreat slightly, effectively cornering Ava. "I must admit the resemblance is quite remarkable. Up close one could almost pass. Where did you find her, darling? Trawling through some agency for desperate lookalikes? Or was she perhaps readily available, somewhere more conveniently priced?" The poisonous insinuation hung in the air, thick and suffocating. Ava felt her face burn with a humiliation so profound it almost eclipsed her fear. She wanted to shrink into the floorboards, to simply cease to exist. She saw Julian flinch, the insult clearly registering, his gaze darting between the two women, the stark contrast between Anastasia's venom and the memory of Ava's gentle demeanor becoming painfully clear. Matilda, who had followed Anastasia to the library door, grasped the situation with the speed of lightning. Her face, already pale, turned a shade of livid fury. "Julian, explain yourself this instant. Who is this woman?" Her voice trembled, not with fear, but with a tightly controlled rage. Julian began, but the words failed him. How could he possibly articulate the bizarre, unbelievable chain of events? How could he confess the depth of his own delusion, his burgeoning feelings for an impostor? But Anastasia, always ready to fan the flames, intervened with a cruel smile. "Oh, Grandma, don't be so dense. It's perfectly obvious, isn't it? While I was off broadening my horizons, it seems my dear fiancé and you, in your infinite resourcefulness, found yourselves a little look-alike to keep my seat warm. A more manageable version, perhaps, less prone to inconvenient opinions or independent thought." She laughed, a sound that made Ava shudder. "Immensely convenient for everyone, I imagine. Tell me," she turned to Ava with false curiosity, her eyes glinting with malice, "did she at least learn how to use the proper fish fork, or does she still eat with her fingers?" The calculated cruelty of the attack, the public stripping of her dignity in front of Julian and the formidable Matilda, was the final snap. The charade had collapsed spectacularly and irreversibly. There was nowhere left to run, no more lies to hide behind. Drawing a ragged breath, fighting back the hot tears of shame and terror that threatened to overflow, Ava gathered the last tattered remnants of her dignity. She stepped forward, out from Julian's faltering shield, facing her accusers. "My name is Ava Petrov," she stated. Her voice came out surprisingly clear, though every fiber of her being trembled. "I am not Anastasia Devereaux. I work as a waitress at Joe's Diner on the South Side. A few weeks ago I was walking home after a very long shift. I was exhausted. I hadn't eaten properly. I collapsed on the street. She looked directly at Matilda, then let her gaze flicker towards Julian, her eyes pleading for a shred of understanding. Your staff found me. They thought I was Miss Devereux because of the resemblance. I woke up here, in this house, in that bed. She gestured vaguely towards the upper floors. I didn't know where I was, what was happening, and I was scared. Her voice faltered for a moment. I saw the luxury. I heard about who you all were. I was terrified you wouldn't believe me, that you'd accuse me of something, call the police. I know it was wrong not to tell the truth immediately, but I just wanted to survive. I never intended to deceive anyone long-term. I was just lost and frightened. The silence that followed her confession was profound, heavy with judgment. Matilda stared at her with undisguised revulsion, as if Ava were a particularly loathsome insect that had crawled into her pristine drawing room. Anastasia watched the unfolding drama with the detached amusement of a spectator at a particularly satisfying play. But it was Julian's face, Julian's reaction, that truly broke Ava's heart. The final pieces of the puzzle clicked into place in his eyes, the confusion replaced by the raw, unmistakable agony of betrayal. The woman he had poured out his conflicted heart to, the woman he had asked to build a new life with moments before, was a complete fraud. A waitress who had woven a web of lies around him since the moment they met. The kindness, the simplicity, the depth he thought he'd found, all now seemed like a calculated performance. The humiliation of having been so thoroughly duped, of having bared his soul to a fabrication, was visible in every tense line of his face. He took a small, almost imperceptible step backward, away from her, a subtle severing that felt like a physical blow. A waitress? Matilda repeated the word, spitting it out as if it were poison. You dare defile my home with your presence, sleep in my granddaughter's bed, wear her clothes, eat at my table, and stand there lying to my face for weeks on end? You insolent, vulgar creature! Her fury, no longer contained, erupted. She whirled on Julian, redirecting her venom. And you, Julian, how could you be so incredibly blind, so pathetically stupid, allowing yourself to be charmed by this nobody who was obviously taking advantage of the situation? Where was your judgment, your loyalty to this family, your common sense? Oh, Grandma, don't be too hard on poor Julian. Anastasia intervened with mock sympathy, clearly delighting in Julian's acute discomfort. Perhaps he found her company as refreshing. Less demanding than mine, I'm sure. Must have been quite a relief for him. She shot Ava a venomous smirk. Tell me, Ava Petrov, was it fun playing princess? Did you enjoy the Egyptian cotton sheets and the vintage champagne while it lasted? Enough! Matilda shrieked, her voice echoing through the silent library. She pointed a trembling, jeweled finger directly at Ava. Security. Now, remove this impostor from my sight. I want her off this property this instant. Check her for stolen property. And call Dr. Albright. I want that charlatan's medical license revoked. And get Jonathan Hemmings, our attorney, on the line. I intend to sue this creature for every penny she doesn't possess. Two large, broad-shouldered men in dark suits, who had materialized silently in the doorway like shadows summoned by Matilda's rage, moved purposefully towards Ava. Their faces were blank professional masks. Pure, unadulterated panic seized Ava. She backed away, her eyes flying to Julian one last time, a final, desperate, silent plea welling up from the depths of her soul. Please, Julian, say something, anything, help me. But Julian remained locked in his own private hell of shock and betrayal. The wound was too fresh, the public humiliation too acute. He saw the raw fear in her eyes, the same vulnerability that had initially drawn him in. But now it was irrevocably tainted by the poison of her deception. His lips parted as if to speak, but no sound emerged. The weight of his name, his position, the crushing blow to his pride and his burgeoning emotions held him captive in silence as the security guards reached Ava, their hands closing firmly, impersonally on her upper arms. The touch felt like brands searing her skin. Julian! She whispered his name one last time, the sound fractured, broken, before she was firmly but efficiently pulled away. She was escorted out of the library, past Anastasia's triumphant smirk, past Matilda's face contorted in implacable hatred. The heavy front door was pulled open, revealing the dark driving rain outside, and Ava was unceremoniously escorted out, thrust into the cold, unforgiving night, clad only in the thin silk nightgown and borrowed robe. A final, cruel mockery of the life she had briefly, falsely inhabited. The door slammed shut behind her with a resonant thud of finality. The humiliation was a physical burn, more painful than the cold that began to seep into her bones. Hot tears streamed down her face, mingling with the raindrops. She was utterly alone, cast out, stripped bare, not just of the borrowed finery, but of the fragile hope she had foolishly allowed herself to feel. She stumbled blindly down the long gravel driveway, the sharp stones cutting at her bare feet through the flimsy slippers she still wore. The opulence that had surrounded her for weeks now seemed grotesque. A cruel joke played at her expense. After what felt like an eternity of shivering progress, one of the estate's security vehicles, a dark SUV, pulled up alongside her. The driver, a middle-aged man with a weary face she vaguely recognized, lowered the window. "Orders from Mrs. Devereux to ensure you, vacate the premises, ma'am. I'll call a taxi to take you back to the city." He showed no hostility, perhaps even a trace of pity in his eyes. Ava could only nod, teeth chattering too hard to form words. She waited in the pouring rain, huddled against the imposing stone gatepost, until a battered yellow taxi arrived, looking utterly alien in the opulent surroundings. The security guard spoke briefly to the driver, handing him a crumpled bill, and Ava crawled into the back seat, curling into a miserable ball on the damp vinyl, leaving behind the mansion, her gilded cage, her impossible dream, forever. The long taxi ride back to her own neglected corner of the city was a blur of misery, self-loathing and chilling fear. The stark contrast between the world she had just been violently ejected from and the world awaiting her was a physical shock. Her tiny, cramped apartment seemed even darker, smaller, the familiar smell of damp and cooking odors from neighboring units now suffocating. She collapsed onto her lumpy mattress, still wearing the damp silk remnants that felt alien against her skin, and cried until exhaustion claimed her, offering a brief, dreamless oblivion. The following days were a struggle for sheer survival, fought under a heavy cloud of shame and anxiety. Swallowing what little pride she had left, Ava dragged herself back to Joe's diner. Joe, after hearing a halting, heavily edited explanation about a difficult family situation, grumbled about her unreliability, about the trouble of finding temporary help. But ultimately, perhaps because dependable waitresses were hard to come by, or perhaps because even his gruff exterior hid a shred of decency, he let her have her job back, docking her pay for the advance he'd given her. Weeks prior, slipping back into the stained apron, picking up trays, forcing smiles, every action felt like a self-imposed punishment. She moved through the motions like an automaton, her spark extinguished. She jumped at every siren, flinched every time. The diner door opened unexpectedly, convinced the police or Matilda's lawyers were coming for her. But the days turned into a week, then 2, and nothing happened. The silence from the Devereux camp was profound, unsettling, leaving her suspended, in a limbo of dread. In the Devereux mansion, the Anastasia storm continued unabated. Demanding, capricious, and resentful, she made life miserable for everyone, especially Julian. The engagement was now a transparent farce, maintained only by Matilda's stubborn determination to save face. Julian, however, was a changed man. The experience with Ava, however painful and deceptive, had forced him to confront the emptiness of his own existence. Anastasia's return only crystallized his feelings. The woman he had fallen for was not the Devereux heiress, but the gentle, dreaming soul he had glimpsed in Ava, even wrapped in lies. He couldn't shake the image of Ava being cast out into the cold night, her terrified, pleading face. He began his own quiet inquiries, using a trusted contact outside the family circle. He confirmed Ava's story, the diner, the apartment, the daily struggle, her unrealized artistic talent. A security guard mentioned seeing her sketching. Joe, when pressed by the investigator, described Ava as a good kid, quiet, hard-working, always drawing on napkins, dreams bigger in her wallet. The investigator found no hint of calculation or prior scams, only poverty and perhaps a single, fear-driven mistake. This didn't excuse the lie, but it painted a picture far removed from Matilda's scheming villainous narrative. It painted a picture of desperation caught in an impossible situation. Armed with this understanding, Julian confronted first Anastasia, then Matilda. The conversation with Anastasia was short, volatile, and ended with him formally breaking the engagement. Her reaction was a predictable storm of fury and threats, quickly followed by bored indifference once financial settlements were mentioned. The confrontation with Matilda was a more protracted battle of wills, the newly awakened heir versus the controlling matriarch. He accused her of cruelty and short-sightedness. She accused him of naivety and familial betrayal. It ended in a cold stalemate. Finally, Julian faced his father, informing him not only of the broken engagement, but also of his decision to take an indefinite leave of absence from the Thorn Corporation to re-evaluate his priorities. The expected paternal explosion occurred, complete with financial threats and accusations of disloyalty. But Julian, for the first time, felt immune to the pressure. The decision was made. He felt a terrifying, exhilarating freedom. With the dust settling in his own tumultuous life, he knew his next, and perhaps most difficult step. It wasn't about guilt or obligation anymore, but about a need for closure, understanding, and maybe, just maybe, offering a different kind of second chance. He drove himself, not in the chauffeured limo, but in his own understated sedan, back to the gritty end of town, back to Joe's diner. The jingle of the bell over the door seemed unnaturally loud in the mid-afternoon lull. He saw her instantly, wiping down a booth near the back, her movements listless, her shoulders slumped in defeat. She looked thinner, paler, the light that had flickered in her eyes, even the light of fear, seemed utterly gone. Seeing her there back in the drab uniform, surrounded by the mundane reality she had briefly escaped, struck him with the full, brutal force of the chasm between their worlds and the inherent cruelty of the illusion they had both inhabited. She looked up as he approached, her eyes widening first in disbelief, then transforming into raw, unadulterated fear. A tray laden with dirty coffee mugs slipped from her suddenly numb fingers, clattering and shattering on the worn linoleum floor, the sharp noise drawing the attention of the few other patrons. "Ava," he said, his voice low, pitched only for her, ignoring the curious stares. What are you doing here?" she stammered, backing away until she hit the wall, her hands flying to her mouth as if to stifle a scream. "Did you come to finish the job? Did your grandmother send you with the police? Are you pressing charges?" Her voice rose, trembling on the verge of hysteria. "No, Ava, none of that." He stopped several feet away, holding his hands up slowly, palms out, in a gesture meant to soothe. "I came alone. I needed to talk to you." He took a breath. "I wanted to apologize for my silence that night, for not understanding sooner, for my part in enabling the whole situation." She stared at him, wild-eyed, suspicion warring with utter confusion. "Apologize?" "Yes." He took another careful step forward. "And to tell you, I ended things. The engagement with Anastasia is over, and I've stepped away from my family's business, at least for now." Ava blinked, slowly processing his words. "But why?" "Because none of it felt real. Not the engagement, not the life they expected." He paused, his gaze searching hers intently. "I know what you did was wrong, Ava. The deception, it hurt. More than I can say. But I've also spent weeks trying to understand why. I don't believe you acted out of malice. I believe you were cornered, scared. And I fell for the person I saw underneath the fear, underneath the lie. Your quiet strength. Your kindness. Your dreams." He glanced down at the mess on the floor, then back at her. "I can't erase what happened, and I don't expect you to trust me or even want to see me, but I felt I owed you an explanation and an apology for not having the courage to stand up for you when it mattered." He saw the tears shimmering in her eyes again, the defenselessness that tore at him. "I don't want your pity, Julian," she whispered, hugging herself tightly. "It's not pity," he said quickly. "It's respect for how you survived, and maybe regret for how easily I was blinded by my own desires." He took another tentative step. "I heard from Joe that you draw, that you dream of being an artist." The mention of her art, her most deeply buried, vulnerable self, seemed to bypass her defenses for a moment. Fresh tears welled, blurring her vision. "It's just sketching, silly things, nothing important." "Anything that comes from your heart is important," Julian insisted gently. "I've been surrounded by important things my whole life that felt utterly meaningless. Now I'm trying to figure out what actually is meaningful." He hesitated, the next words feeling impossibly risky. "I know I have absolutely no right to ask anything of you, but I was wondering if maybe, just maybe, you'd let me buy you a coffee sometime. Not here, somewhere else, somewhere neutral." He offered a small, uncertain smile that didn't quite reach his eyes. No Devereaux, no thorns, no lies, no pretenses. Just Ava and Julian. We could just talk. You could tell me about your sketches if you felt like it, or tell me to get lost, whichever you prefer. Ava stood frozen, the forgotten mop dripping beside her, the smell of stale coffee and shattered ceramic filling the air. His offer hung there, an unexpected, fragile bridge across the vast canyon of their experiences. Could she? Dare she? The fear was a physical weight, the memory of humiliation a fresh wound. Trusting him felt like stepping off a cliff, but looking into his eyes, she didn't see the aloof air or the deceived fiancé. She saw a man grappling with his own truths, offering not a return to fantasy, but a tentative hand towards simple, honest human connection. It was the smallest of gestures, yet it felt immense. After a silence that stretched taut, punctuated only by the clatter of dishes from the unseen kitchen, Ava slowly, almost imperceptibly, nodded. A single tear escaped, tracing a path through the grime on her cheek, but for the first time in weeks it wasn't solely a tear of despair. Mixed with the sorrow, there was a minuscule, terrifying spark of something else. Hope. "Okay, Julian," she whispered, her voice barely audible above the diner's hum. "Okay, a coffee and maybe I'll show you some sketches." A flicker of genuine, profound relief washed over Julian's face, softening the lines of tension around his eyes. It wasn't forgiveness, not by a long shot. It wasn't a promise nor a guarantee, but it was a start. A fragile, uncertain, terrifyingly real beginning, emerging unexpectedly from the wreckage of elaborate lies and painful illusions. They stood there for another moment amidst the debris, two souls from vastly different orbits, linked by a bizarre and tumultuous past, now facing the daunting, uncertain possibility of an honest future, one quiet conversation at a time. What did you think of Ava and Julian's incredible story? Did the ending surprise you? Let us know your thoughts in the comments below. If you enjoyed this journey, please give this video a thumbs up and subscribe to the channel for more heartwarming and dramatic stories just like this one. Don't forget to turn on notifications so you never miss an upload.